The purpose of this little presentation is to introduce you to the concepts of exposure assessment in environmental health. Um, this is an important topic for us to study in environmental health because the main purpose of environmental health risk assessment is to identify what are the possible dangers and damages that can happen if somebody is exposed to certain environmental hazards. Environmental hazard assessment begins with exposure assessment. So in here we see that what are the external agents to which human beings are in contact and what can we do about them. So let's get started. In this particular situation, the first thing that we would like to do in exposure assessment is to get a sense of what is meant by exposure. And exposure basically is almost any entity that comes in contact with the human body. For example, when we talk in terms of exposure to pollutants in the air, what we mean is this, that all the pollutants that are present in the air that comes in contact with our respiratory system or our skin that we are exposed to. So for example, in ultraviolet radiation, when we if we consider ultraviolet radiation as a source of contaminant or as an exposure, then the ultraviolet radiation that comes in contact with human skin um, is the amount of ultraviolet radiation that strikes human skin or our skin surfaces, that is considered to be our exposure. So anything that comes in contact with the human body in some ways. Similarly, if if we visit a particular area or a site and we see and we experience an offending odor, then that offending odor comes in contact with our nostrils. So the exposure are the chemicals that are present in the air sample that comes in contact with our nostril and our sense organs of smell, particularly the olfactory epithelia in the roof of the nose, and that is the exposure. And consider that there is a sense of an external surface of the body, and the externalization of the surface of the body basically means not only our nostrils or our respiratory passages, but also, say, for example, the gastrointestinal tract and the lining mucous membrane. Um, you could also consider that to be an external aspect of the human body, because everything else is then contained within the body tissues, which is a different thing. We also have to understand while we are here that there is a difference between exposure and dose. So dose is the amount of the agent of interest in the exposure, whereas exposure is something that is present externally. So exposure becomes dose when we measure the concentration that enters the human body. So let's take a look at now as to what are the pathways in which exposure actually operates in our body to produce health effects. And you can see here from top down that exposure can have an origin, or there is a production of that exposure, which often is known as emissions. So it could be because of human activities. Say, for example, if a group of people went into a forest area, cut down trees, and then lit a bonfire, then the particulate matter and the carbon and everything else that will be produced in the air as a result of that bonfire are because of human activities. But they can also be because of natural hazards. For example, in the Christchurch earthquake, those of you who had an experience of it, you knew that there were phenomena such as liquefaction of the Earth's surface, and there were dust and other things that got raised because of the destruction of the buildings and physical structures. So quite often, the natural hazards also are responsible for emitting pollutants into the environment. And then what happens is this, that as a result of those emissions, environment becomes contaminated. So the air becomes contaminated, the water becomes contaminated, the food particles or the food that we eat, they often become sometimes poisoned, sometimes they get rotten, and some people get access to that. the soil becomes contaminated for a number of different reasons. And then through those media, that is air, water, soil, food, um, we get an exposure to those things, to the contaminants. And that as a result of that exposure, the contaminant enters the human body, and the amount of that exposure or the substance of that exposure that enters the human body, that becomes the dose. The dose, however, is a difficult concept to grasp in the sense that the dose then actually starts acting on the human systems, and therefore at a particular target organ it becomes a target organ dose, and that produces the health effects as far as we understand. For example, think of inorganic arsenic, which is a chemical compound, and we'll see in a second. Say, for example, an inorganic arsenic is dissolved in drinking water. However, inorganic arsenic can also be in air. It can arise as a result of activities such as smelting or copper smelting, for example. So inorganic arsenic, when a human being can be exposed to inorganic arsenic in a number of different ways. So either drinking the water, which is contaminated with arsenic, or visiting a particular area or working in a copper smelting plant in which it could be an occupational exposure. Be that as it may, um, either through respiratory passages or through the gut, inorganic arsenic then enters the bloodstream. And after inorganic arsenic enters the bloodstream, it goes into liver, where inorganic arsenic is converted into the organic forms by a process of repeated reduction and methylation. And and because of the methylation process, and as part of the methylation process, as part of the reduction process, several chemical compounds are needed, and these deplete the body of folate and other kinds of micronutrients. And further, methylation process also impacts the DNA in many different ways, which are known as epigenetic changes. And by the by, because of these activities, specific speciations of methylated arsenic are responsible for emergence of several different kinds of health effects. For example, skin lesions, skin cancer, lung cancer, bladder cancer, etc. So this is one way in which exposure to arsenic can inflict health effects in the human system. And the way we measure that a person was exposed to arsenic is not only by measuring the drinking water that that person was, or measuring arsenic content of the drinking water that the person consumed, but also by measuring arsenic that is excreted in the urine as a result of the methylation process, because by that means we know that the inorganic arsenic had actually had a chance to reach the target dose, and was probably the reason why these particular health effects occur. So therefore, when we talk in terms of exposure assessment, we need to be mindful about three important concepts. The first concept is a concept of classification of exposure. So a person who is exposed at the simplest level can be considered to be either exposed or non-exposed. But depending on the level of the dose that the person has acquired, or the level of the concentration of the agent in the environment to which a person is exposed to, there can be an ordinal level of exposure. So for example, it could be exposed, non-exposed, or non-exposed or unexposed, moderate exposure, heavy exposure. So there are indeed many different ways in which this can be classified. The second important concept that we need to understand, for example, is the issue of measurement. That is direct physical measurement of the particular contaminant in the media that we are interested in. So in case of air pollution, for example, we would really like to measure air pollutants. And for example, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulate matter 10, the visibility of the air, etc. All of these are valid measurements to say that there is a contamination of air or pollution of the air. In those circumstances or in those situations where you cannot really have a direct way of measuring the extent of exposure, in those cases, modeling are often attempted. Modeling actually is a complicated statistical procedure and it is beyond the scope of this particular lecture. But modeling basically indicates that using statistical and mathematical means, it is quite possible to kind of estimate or assess what is the level to which people are exposed to the specific agent of interest. Here, for example, we see that there are many different ways in which air quality can be measured. And for example, air quality can be measured from very high to very low level. Very high level air quality measurement can be conducted by using what is known as satellite data. So using satellites, one can use the ground haze, and you can see here, for example, air quality measurement was done by noting the surface of a particular part of the Earth, a particular region of the United States, and you can see that there are haze over the land, haze over the Atlantic Ocean, around the Washington D.C. You can see a few things there, fire and smoke. So it gives you a good sense that air quality can be measured using haze data, because the haze data then can be used to model how much of particulate matter were present. And then we have got another slide over here. For example, we can see that that these are the different kinds of data that we take for, like ozone, nitrogen dioxide, visibility, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter. We can do this. The second thing that we talk about is the concept of what is known as weighted average. So in this particular situation, we identify what are the different situations of exposure. So now, coming down to the more low level of measurement of air pollution, you can actually measure indoor air quality in room to room. Say in a house we have got 3 different rooms, R1, R2, and R3, and we identify the percentage of time that a person spends in each of these rooms of a day. So for an individual really low level, we can identify that maybe he or she was spending 40% of his or her time in the first room, 30% in the second room, and 20% in another room, maybe 10% in another part. But what we would like to do then, in each of these 3 rooms, we could measure their average contamination concentration and then sum them up. You can do this. Another way in which we could think is in terms of measurement of contaminations at different levels. Again, for example, without begging the point further, you could use the same concept for measurement of water pollution. Water pollution, for example, will be through the pathways of drinking, inhalation, that is, if you splash around and water vapors are inhaled, or maybe contact of water. If the water is particularly contaminated, then contact with the water is also another way in which you can get exposed to the pollutants in water. You can use turbidity in the water, or you can use coliform count for measurement of how much water is contaminated. And water is usually purified using water chlorination and fluoridation. We shall be reviewing this more when we actually come to that particular topic of water contamination and water sanitation and hygiene. So I'll leave that topic till then. Lastly, when we make measurements of water and food-based contaminants, one of the things that we would really like to do is to make a matrix of the concentration in a particular media and the time through which that is spent. And you multiply the 2 things together, and thus you get a good sense of the extent of measurement or extent of contamination and pollution that people are exposed to. This gives you a good sense of how much exposure to assess. There are other ways of gathering exposure data, for example, using questionnaire. So particularly in case of food situations or experiences of people in an exposure situation, it is quite possible to get draft questionnaires and using cross-sectional surveys to gather that kind of data. So this kind of provides you with a quick overview of what exposure assessment basically means. Remember that in case of exposure assessment, you need to understand the source, the way exposure data are dispersed across, and think about five important sources, five important points about gathering exposure data. So understand the source, understand the pathway, try to understand the classification of the individuals who are exposed to the factor of interest. In other words, whether they're exposed, non-exposed, if they're exposed, to what extent they're exposed, etc. Um, Issues around measurement will depend on the way the source of exposure is produced and dispersed across the media. And when measurement becomes very difficult or cannot be possible, one can use modeling. The reason why exposure assessment is important is this, that exposure is at the center of environmental health risk assessment, because exposure gives us a sense of the hazard that is present in the environment. Exposure also helps us to try and understand the dose, and the dose is important for assessment of effect. So this concludes a brief lecture on exposure assessment. Thank you.